trade is that countries and companies can specialize, meaning that they can produce something that they're relatively better at. And when they do that, they're able to trade and actually both consume more. And so there are a number of reasons for specialization. In this video, we're going to talk about comparative advantage, which basically means that you have a lower opportunity cost of producing a specific good. But there are also economies of agglomeration, meaning that if you are a high-tech company, there are going to be benefits to being in Silicon Valley because you're around a labor market where there are lots of people that do what you do. There are other companies that can help you out, that you'll learn from. And then finally, there are economies of scale, things that we've talked about before, where producing more actually lowers your marginal cost. And so specializing can help reduce costs and therefore increase your profits and reduce prices for consumers. So comparative advantage is really all about the opportunity cost. And so we contrast that to absolute advantage. So we're going to talk about two people, one on what we're going to call Apple Island and one on what we're going to call Wheat Island. And we're going to see that Greta, who lives on, I think, Apple Island, has the absolute advantage in producing both wheat and apples. She can produce more. It's a better island for growing food. But as we'll see, they have different comparative advantages, which is more like a relative advantage because they don't have to give up the same amount of the other good to produce. And so when there are different comparative advantages, then there are always benefits to trade. And what we're going to see is that trading, when there are different comparative advantages, is kind of like an increase in technology because it allows you to consume outside your original feasible frontier. So here's Carlos. Oh, Carlos lives on Apple Island. So Carlos can either produce 4,000 bushels of wheat or 10,000 apples, okay? Or any point along that feasible frontier, right? You might have seen this as a PPF, a production possibility frontier. This book prefers the term feasible frontier. And so Carlos can sort of choose, all right, well, do I want to produce all wheat? Do I want to produce all apples? Or he can produce someplace in the middle, right? So maybe C, where he produces 2,000 bushels of wheat and 5,000 apples, is where he maximizes his utility. Now, Greta, who lives on Wheat Island, can either produce 10,000 bushels of wheat or 12,500 apples. So now, as we said before, Greta has the absolute advantage in producing both wheat and apples because she can produce more of either one. So her feasible set is in here. She can produce somewhere along this feasible frontier. So let's think about what Carlos's utility maximizing choice of consumption is when those islands are separated, when there's no trade between them. So here are Carlos's indifference curves, right? And we know that indifference curves from microeconomics increase utility as we move away from the origin. So this one at the bottom is a lower utility, this one in the middle is a higher utility, and this one at the top is the highest utility. Now he can't obtain that highest utility because that's not part of his feasible frontier, but he can attain this medium level of utility. And so that's where Carlos will consume when there's no trade between the islands, at 2,500 bushels of wheat and 3,750 apples. Greta, similarly, will choose to consume on her highest indifference curve, where her utility is the highest, and that is 6,000 bushels of wheat and 5,000 apples at point E. So then the question is trade going to be able to increase their consumption even though Greta has an absolute advantage in producing both wheat and apples? And as we'll see, the answer is yes. So let's look at what we can do, okay? So we know that Carlos on Apple Island can produce either 400 bushels of wheat or 1,000 apples. So that means that his relative price of wheat is just 1,000 divided by 400, or 2.5. He has to give up 2.5 apples to produce a bushel of wheat. 2.5 bushels of wheat to produce an apple. Where the relative price of apples is just 400 divided by 1,000, or 0.4. So this is the opportunity cost of producing those goods. And we can see they're just reciprocals, right? And so because they're reciprocals, if one is higher for one person, the other is going to be higher for the other person. So for Wheat Island, for Greta, she can produce either 1,000 bushels of wheat or 1,250 apples. And so her relative price of wheat is just 1,250 apples divided by 1,000, or 1.25. And her relative price of apples is 1,000 divided by 1,250, or 0.8. So if we look at the prices, Greta has a lower price for producing wheat. 1.25 is lower than 2.5. And Carlos has a lower price of producing apples, 0.4 compared to 0.8. And so we can see that their opportunity costs are lower. And that's actually going to allow them to trade and both be better off. So here we see their original feasible frontiers, right? Here's Carlos's feasible frontier, and here's Greta's feasible frontier. But now if they trade, they can actually increase their consumption frontier, right? If Greta produces all wheat, then she can produce 10,000 and then trade it for Carlos's apples. And Carlos can produce all apples and then trade it for some wheat. Now, the interesting thing is that this model doesn't exactly tell us the trade that's going to happen, but it does tell us that trade is possible because they have different comparative advantages. And so here you can see that Greta has increased her feasible consumption frontier by more than Carlos. And she may consume, here at 8,000 bushels of wheat and 4,000 apples, and he consumes at 2,000 bushels of wheat and 6,000 apples. Both of those points were originally outside of their feasible frontiers. If Greta is able to dictate the price, then she can get even more compared to Carlos, right? Because, so remember, if there's a range of possible bargains, then whoever can dictate the price can benefit more from the trade. It doesn't mean that Carlos doesn't benefit some from the trade, but it means he's going to benefit less. And so in this case, Greta would be able to consume even more wheat, and Carlos would consume a little less, although he would still be consuming more than he would be able to by himself. And of course, that has to be the case, right? Because otherwise he could just say, no, I'm not interested in trading. So as long as the trading is voluntary, then we know that the trade is improving his ability to consume.